Right now, as you're watching this, the world's most critical waterway is on fire, and Washington is calling it a ceasefire. Let that sink in for a moment. The United Arab Emirates, a key American ally, just absorbed 15 Iranian missiles and 4 drones in a single day. Oil facilities in Fujairah are burning, cargo ships are ablaze in the Gulf, and Pete Hegseth stands at a Pentagon podium and tells the American people, no, the ceasefire is not over. That is the reality we are living in right now. A sharp escalation in attacks in the Strait of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf is threatening the already shaky ceasefire between Iran and the United States, as both sides struggle to make any real progress toward a lasting end to the war. Here's what you need to understand, and understand deeply. The Strait of Hormuz, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, serves as the transit corridor for roughly 20% of all global seaborne oil, approximately 20 million barrels every single day. When that artery bleeds, the entire global economy bleeds with it. U.S. gas prices have already increased by 50% since the start of this war. That's not a foreign policy number. That's the price you paid the last time you filled your tank. Now, Washington launched what it calls Operation Project Freedom, a naval escort mission to physically push merchant ships through the strait. Iran's response was immediate and unambiguous. Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf posted a stark warning. We know full well that the continuation of the status quo is intolerable for America, while we have not even begun yet. That is not the language of a nation that is finished fighting. That is the language of a nation that believes it still holds the initiative. Trump himself has not ruled out resuming a full bombing campaign if negotiations collapse or Iran breaks what remains of the current ceasefire. And here's the part that the mainstream conversation keeps glossing over. Iran's President Pezeshkian has stated that war reparations are the only way to end this conflict, while Iran also demands the release of frozen state funds and assets held by the United States. These are not negotiating footnotes. These are fundamental red lines on both sides. This is not winding down. This is a conflict reloading. And if you think what happens in the Strait of Hormuz stays in the Middle East, you're about to get a very expensive lesson in how interconnected this world truly is. So let's go back to the beginning, because if you don't understand how we got here, you won't fully understand how dangerous this moment actually is. And I want you to understand it completely. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched large-scale strikes against Iran. They said the aim was to induce regime change and to target Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. In those initial strikes, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Let that sentence just sit there for a second. The supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, a man who had shaped that country's ideology, its foreign policy, its resistance strategy for decades, was assassinated by American and Israeli military action. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most consequential acts of war in the 21st century. And most Americans, if you stop them on the street right now and ask them about it, they couldn't tell you the details. They couldn't tell you the timeline. They couldn't tell you what followed. And what followed is exactly what we need to talk about today, because what followed was not the collapse of Iran. What followed was not the easy regime change that the planners in Tel Aviv and Washington had hoped for. What followed was the Strait of Hormuz going dark. Within hours of the strikes, Iran's Revolutionary Guard transmitted warnings via VHF radio to vessels in the strait, stating that no ships would be permitted to pass. Ship tracking data immediately showed a 70% reduction in traffic. 70%. Almost overnight, one of the most vital arteries of global commerce, a waterway that carries roughly a fifth of the world's seaborne oil supply every single day, was effectively shut down. And the people who planned this war apparently did not have a serious answer for what happened next. Now, I've spent a long time studying how wars begin, how they escalate, and how they end. And one of the things I've learned is that when political leaders go into a war with a predetermined outcome in their minds, they tend to catastrophically misread the enemy's willingness to absorb pain. That's what happened here. The assumption seemed to be that Iran would fold, that the shock of losing Khamenei, the shock of American air power, would cause the system to buckle inward. Instead, Iran appointed a successor, consolidated its military command, and immediately weaponized the one tool it has always held over the entire global economy, geography, the Strait of Hormuz, that narrow 21-mile channel that sits between the Iranian coastline and the coast of Oman. Iran didn't need to win a conventional battle. It just needed to make that waterway unusable. And it did exactly that. Iran charged tolls of over $1 million per ship for those who wanted to transit through its preferred northern route along the Iranian coastline, requiring ships to be vetted by the IRGC before being allowed to pass. Think about what that means strategically. Iran essentially turned a global maritime highway into a toll booth that it controlled at gunpoint. Shipping companies including Maersk, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, the giants of global trade, suspended transits entirely, and sitting in the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go were hundreds of loaded oil tankers, over 230 of them, according to reports, bottled up and waiting. The global oil market didn't just react, it convulsed. And then came the negotiations, or rather, the attempts at negotiation, because what unfolded over the following weeks was one of the most chaotic and convoluted diplomatic processes in modern American history. Pakistan brokered a 15-point proposal from the U.S. to Iran. The U.S. proposal included an end to Iran's nuclear program, limits on its missiles, reopening the Strait of Hormuz, and restrictions on Iran's support for armed groups, with sanctions relief offered in return. Iran rejected it outright, with one official stating that Iran would end the war when it decided to do so, and when its own conditions were met. That is not the language of a side that's been defeated. That is the language of a side that believes it still has leverage. And it was right. Iran came back with its own 5-point counter proposal, demanding an end to U.S.-Israeli attacks, security guarantees against future aggression, war reparations, and international recognition of Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, you might read that last demand and think it's absurd, but I want you to think about it from Tehran's perspective for a moment. They're not negotiating from a position of total weakness here. Analysts suggested that Iran emerged from the early talks with a slight strategic edge, having demonstrated it can endure economic pain longer than the United States can tolerate the disruption to global oil flows. That is a profound observation, and it goes to the heart of everything that has happened since. On April 8th, a ceasefire was announced. Mediated by Pakistan, brokered through back channels involving J.D. Vance, Steve Witkoff, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, and Trump announced it triumphantly, claiming that Iran would immediately open the strait and that a peace agreement was being finalized. But here's where reality started to immediately diverge from the announcement. By April 9th, there was no sign that the agreement to lift the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz was being implemented, with ships once again being prevented from moving through the strait. One day after the ceasefire was declared, and then Israel launched fresh attacks on Lebanon, which it claimed was not covered by the ceasefire, and Iran paused Hormuz traffic again in response. The whole thing started unraveling almost from the moment it was stitched together. The Islamabad talks on April 11th produced no agreement. Trump said most points were agreed to, but that the only point that really mattered, nuclear, was not resolved. He described Iran as unyielding. Iran's foreign minister said a deal was just inches away, but criticized what he called maximalist demands from the American side. Both of those statements can simultaneously be true, and it doesn't matter, because when the core issue, Iran's nuclear program and enriched uranium stockpile, cannot be resolved, everything else is window dressing. A ceasefire without a framework for nuclear resolution is just a pause, and everyone in that room in Islamabad knew it. Now let's talk about the players who are watching all of this from a comfortable distance and quietly benefiting. Because there is a geopolitical dimension to this conflict that the American media consistently underplays. Russia and China are not passive observers here. Moscow and Beijing have both condemned U.S. and Israeli military operations against Iran. However, the conflict has proven lucrative for Moscow as oil prices have soared. In the first quarter of 2026, 90% of Russia's total crude oil exports were delivered to China and India, and Russia's energy revenues have surged dramatically. Think about the irony of that for a moment. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains closed or constrained, every day that global oil supplies remain under pressure, Russia's bank account gets a little heavier. Vladimir Putin doesn't need to fire a single missile to benefit from this war. He just needs to sit back and watch. According to analysis from the Peterson Institute, Russia could see as much as $161 billion in additional export revenues in a 3-month conflict scenario, roughly $500 million a day, with extra budget revenues exceeding Russia's entire 2025 fiscal deficit, $500 million a day in extra revenue. While Russian forces continue operations in Ukraine and while the West continues to try and financially strangle Moscow through sanctions, the Iran war has essentially handed Russia an economic lifeline that Western policymakers never anticipated, and nobody in Washington seems to be connecting those dots loudly enough. China and Russia, according to analysts, are adopting a strategy of indirectly benefiting from the conflict while avoiding direct military intervention. Both see this as an opportunity to drain American resources. Russia, in particular, views a war against Iran as a strategic debt being repaid, a way to tie down American military attention and deplete U.S. missile interceptor stockpiles while Russia operates in Europe. The strategy is to transform Iran into what Ukraine has been for the West, a grinding, resource-consuming conflict with no clean exit. That framing should stop you cold, because that is exactly what this is starting to look like, a war with no clean exit. And China's calculation here is just as sophisticated. Beijing has stockpiled petroleum reserves sufficient for more than 120 days in anticipation of a possible extended closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Every day that America is preoccupied with the Middle East is considered by China as valuable time to bolster its military capabilities around the Taiwan Strait and establish new realities on the ground without significant international media attention. While we are focused on drones over the UAE and torpedo boats in the Gulf, China is watching the Pacific, the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea. Beijing's strategists understand something very clearly. American attention is a finite resource, and right now that finite resource is almost entirely consumed by Iran. As one analysis from the Atlantic Council put it, if Iran continues to constrain traffic through Hormuz while making exceptions for Beijing, the consequences become systemic. Sanctions regimes fracture as U.S. allies prioritize domestic energy security over geopolitical solidarity. The exposure of limits in U.S. coercive power, not just in the region, but in the eyes of every actor watching from Taipei to Vilnius, is the most consequential outcome, more damaging than any battlefield result. This is the real stakes of this conflict, not just whether oil ships can pass through a 21-mile channel, but whether the United States can still project credible power on a global stage, whether allies in Europe and Asia trust that Washington can actually deliver on its commitments. That question is being answered right now in real time, and the answer is not clean. Back to what is happening this week, because this is where the mask comes off completely. On May 4th, Trump launched Operation Project Freedom, a U.S. Navy mission to physically escort merchant ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Former military officers who have served in the strait have said opening it would be dangerous and highly challenging even with military escorts, noting there is little room to maneuver in a waterway just 21 miles wide, and that Iran can reach all of the strait and its approaches with cruise missiles. So we are sending naval escorts into a confined channel where the enemy has cruise missiles, drones, sea mines, and small boat swarms, and the Pentagon is calling this a defensive operation. The semantic gymnastics required to maintain that framing should tell you everything you need to know about how politically uncomfortable this situation has become. Schools across the UAE are now operating remotely. The Emirati Ministry of Education shifted students to distance learning through the end of the week after renewed Iranian strikes targeted the country. Let that image crystallize for you. Children in one of the wealthiest, most modern cities on earth, sitting at home doing school over a laptop because Iranian drones and missiles are falling on their country. The UAE is an American partner. It hosts U.S. military bases. And right now, Iranian drones are striking oil facilities in Fujairah, which is significant because Fujairah sits outside the strait itself, one of the few oil export routes that doesn't require passing through the choke point. Iran is closing escape routes. That is a deliberate and sophisticated military strategy, not random escalation. Iran's parliament speaker and chief negotiator Kalibov posted a warning that is worth reading very carefully. He said, "We know full well that the continuation of the status quo is intolerable for America, while we have not even begun yet." He said, "We have not even begun yet." And I want you to think about what that means coming from the man who is simultaneously Iran's chief negotiator and a senior military figure. He's not just blowing smoke, he's telling you something real about Iran's strategic calculus. Tehran believes it still has escalatory options it has not yet deployed, and if that's true, and I believe it probably is, then what we're seeing right now is not the worst of this conflict. It may be just the beginning of the worst. Trump has not ruled out resuming a full bombing campaign if negotiations collapse or Iran breaks the ceasefire. Rubio has said questions about Iran's nuclear program, including its stockpile of highly enriched uranium buried deep underground, will have to be resolved through talks. But here's the core problem with that position. Iran has said it will not accept any further temporary ceasefires. It has made clear that it wants permanent security guarantees backed by China, Russia, Pakistan, and Turkey before it agrees to anything lasting. Those are structural demands. They are not demands that can be met in a back-channel message passed through Pakistani intermediaries over the course of a few days. And yet the clock is ticking. American gas prices are up 50%. Global demand for oil is falling at the fastest pace outside of the COVID pandemic. Supply chains are rupturing, and two of the most powerful adversaries of the United States, Russia and China, are sitting on the sidelines watching Washington exhaust itself and quietly making money while it happens. The ceasefire that Washington is desperately trying to hold together right now was never really a ceasefire. It was a pause dressed up in ceasefire language to buy time. J.D. Vance himself called it a fragile truce on the day it was announced. That admission from inside the White House tells you everything. They knew it wasn't solid. They announced it anyway because the political pressure was immense and because Trump needed something to point to. But fragile truces don't hold when one side is conducting naval operations inside the contested waterway and the other side is firing missiles at oil facilities. Fragile truces collapse, and right now we are watching that collapse unfold in slow motion while official Washington stands at a podium and insists the ceasefire is holding. The American people deserve to understand what is actually at stake. This is not a regional skirmish. This is not a contained Middle Eastern crisis that stays neatly within geographic borders. As one analyst put it, if Iran taking 20% of global oil supply offline threatened the United States with a recession and prompted a bitter political backlash, including in the president's own party, the dependence of the entire world economy on Taiwan and the goods that travel on the sea routes around Taiwan is an order of magnitude larger. In other words, what Iran has done, using geography as a weapon, using a choke point as leverage, has handed every adversary of the United States a template, a playbook, a demonstration that you don't need nuclear weapons or a blue water navy to bring the most powerful country in the world to the negotiating table. You just need to sit on the right piece of coastline and be willing to endure. That is the lesson being studied in Beijing right now. That is the lesson being studied in Pyongyang, in Moscow, in Tehran itself. And unless this conflict ends with a credible, enforceable, and genuinely mutual agreement, not a tweet and a handshake, that lesson will define the next chapter of global power politics for years to come. The conflict did not restart. It never fully stopped. What stopped was the pretense that it had.